The morning sun cast long shadows across Kensington Palace as Kate stood by the window, watching the gardeners tend to the roses below. She had been awake since dawn, unable to shake the feeling that something was different about William lately. Her husband of 12 years had always been private, but recent weeks had brought a new kind of silence that made her heart race with worry. William had left early that morning for what he called royal duties, but Kate noticed he hadn't taken his usual security detail. The black sedan that normally waited for him remained parked in the courtyard, and his personal protection officer seemed just as confused as she was. When she asked about William's whereabouts, the staff exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their own uncertainty. The palace felt unusually quiet that Tuesday morning. Even the children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, seemed to sense the tension in the air. They ate their breakfast in subdued tones, occasionally glancing at their mother as if waiting for her to explain why their father had been so distant lately. Kate forced smiles and made small talk about their school activities, but her mind kept wandering to the locked drawer in William's study that had appeared 3 weeks ago. She had noticed the drawer during one of her regular visits to his office. William had always been open about his correspondence and royal obligations, often sharing interesting letters from Commonwealth citizens or discussing upcoming engagements. But this drawer remained sealed with a small brass lock, and whenever she entered the room, William would quickly close whatever document he was reading and slide it away from view. The morning dragged on with excruciating slowness. Kate tried to focus on her charity work, reviewing proposals for her early childhood development initiative, but the words blurred together on the page. She found herself checking her phone every few minutes, hoping for a message from William that never came. His silence wasn't just unusual, it was completely out of character for a man who typically called or texted throughout the day to share small moments or ask about the children. Around midday, Maria Santos, Kate's trusted lady-in-waiting, knocked softly on the study door. Her face carried the same worried expression that had become common among the palace staff in recent days. She informed Kate that several journalists had been calling, asking about William's whereabouts and whether there were any upcoming announcements from the royal household. The questions were vague but persistent, suggesting that whatever William was dealing with might already be attracting outside attention. Kate felt her stomach tighten as she realized the implications. Royal protocol demanded that all public appearances and significant meetings be coordinated through the palace's communication team. If journalists were asking questions, it meant William's mysterious activities had somehow leaked beyond the palace walls. She instructed Maria to handle the inquiries with standard responses about the Prince of Wales maintaining a private schedule, but she knew this approach wouldn't work for long. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Charles, now King Charles III, arrived at Kensington Palace without his usual fanfare. Kate watched from the window as he stepped out of his car, his face grave with concern. He had clearly come to discuss something important with her, and the fact that he hadn't requested William's presence spoke volumes about the nature of his visit. Their conversation in the drawing room was brief, but revealing. Charles explained that he had been receiving reports about William's recent behavior from various sources within the royal household. There were mentions of private meetings with lawyers, unexplained absences from scheduled events, and phone conversations conducted in hushed tones behind closed doors. The king's concerns mirrored Kate's own observations, but hearing them voiced aloud made the situation feel more real and more frightening. Charles assured Kate that he wasn't trying to interfere in their marriage, but as both a father and a monarch, he felt obligated to understand what was happening. He had tried reaching out to William directly, but their conversations had been superficial and unsatisfying. William deflected questions about his recent activities with vague references to personal matters that required discretion, leaving Charles with more questions than answers. As evening approached, Kate found herself standing in William's study, staring at the mysterious locked drawer. The room smelled of his cologne and the leather-bound books that lined the walls, familiar scents that usually brought comfort, but now seemed to mock her confusion. She had always respected William's need for privacy regarding certain royal matters, but this felt different. This felt personal and potentially devastating. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, marking another hour of William's absence. Kate realized she hadn't heard from him in over 10 hours, an unprecedented length of silence in their relationship. She tried calling his mobile phone, but it went directly to voicemail. His private secretary claimed no knowledge of his location, and even his closest friends within the royal circle seemed genuinely puzzled when she made discreet inquiries. Dinner time arrived with still no word from William. Kate sat with the children, maintaining the pretense of normalcy while her mind raced through increasingly worrying scenarios. George asked when Daddy would be home, and Kate found herself promising he would return soon, though she had no evidence to support that assurance. Charlotte noticed her mother's distraction and squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture of comfort that nearly brought Kate to tears. As night fell over Kensington Palace, Kate stood once again by the bedroom window, watching the gates for any sign of William's return. The palace gardens were illuminated by soft lighting, creating a scene of peaceful beauty that contrasted sharply with the turmoil in her heart. She had always prided herself on being a supportive royal wife, capable of handling the pressures and uncertainties that came with their position, but this situation felt beyond her experience or understanding. The sound of a car engine in the distance made her heart leap, but the vehicle passed by without stopping. Kate realized that she was holding her breath, waiting for something she couldn't define. Whatever William was hiding, whatever door he had opened that she knew nothing about, she sensed that their lives were about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. The silence from the royal household was deafening, and for the first time in her marriage, Kate felt truly alone in facing an uncertain future. William finally returned to Kensington Palace at 11:30 that night, his footsteps echoing through the marble hallway with unusual heaviness. Kate heard the front door close and felt a mixture of relief and apprehension wash over her. She had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling for hours, rehearsing the conversation they needed to have. When she heard him climbing the stairs, she sat up and switched on the bedside lamp, preparing herself for answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The bedroom door opened slowly, and William appeared looking haggard and emotionally drained. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled as if he had spent the day in difficult conversations. Kate studied his face, searching for clues about where he had been and what had kept him away for so long. The man who entered their bedroom seemed like a stranger, carrying the weight of something that had fundamentally changed him. William avoided Kate's eyes as he moved through their evening routine, removing his cufflinks and hanging up his jacket with mechanical precision. The silence between them felt heavy and unnatural, filled with unspoken questions and growing tension. Kate wanted to demand explanations, to express her worry and frustration, but something in William's demeanor warned her that this wasn't the right moment. Instead, she watched and waited, hoping he would find the courage to share whatever burden he was carrying. When William finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told Kate that he had been meeting with people who could help them understand something that had recently come to light about his family's history. The details were vague and unsatisfying, but Kate could hear the genuine distress in his voice. He explained that certain documents had surfaced that required careful examination and discreet handling, documents that could potentially impact not just their family but the entire royal institution. Kate felt her chest tighten as she processed William's words. The royal family had weathered many storms over the decades, from personal scandals to constitutional crises, but something in William's tone suggested this was different. She asked directly whether their marriage was in danger, whether the children would be affected, and whether she needed to prepare for public scrutiny. William's hesitation before answering told her everything she needed to know about the seriousness of the situation. The next morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over their household. William left early again, this time with a brief kiss on Kate's forehead and a promise that he would explain everything soon. The gesture felt more like an apology than reassurance, and Kate spent the morning pacing through the palace rooms, trying to make sense of fragments of information that didn't form a coherent picture. The palace staff had clearly noticed the change in atmosphere. Conversations stopped abruptly when Kate entered rooms, and she caught several worried glances exchanged between longtime employees who had served the family for years. Maria approached her carefully around midday, informing her that additional security measures had been quietly implemented around the palace grounds. When Kate asked why, Maria could only say that the orders had come from William's office without explanation. Kate decided to take matters into her own hands. She made her way to William's study, determined to understand what was happening to her family. The locked drawer seemed to mock her from across the room, holding secrets that were tearing apart the foundation of their marriage. She tried the handle, knowing it would be locked but hoping for a miracle. The drawer remained sealed, but she noticed that William had left some papers on his desk in his haste that morning. The documents were legal in nature, filled with terminology that Kate didn't fully understand but that clearly related to inheritance laws and succession rights. There were references to historical precedents and constitutional interpretations that seemed to question fundamental assumptions about royal legitimacy. Kate's hands trembled as she read, beginning to grasp that whatever William was dealing with could threaten not just their personal happiness but the entire structure of their royal life. A phone call interrupted her investigation. The caller identified himself as Thomas Mitchell, a constitutional lawyer who needed to speak with William urgently about time-sensitive matters. When Kate explained that William wasn't available, Mitchell's tone became more serious. He mentioned that other parties were aware of the situation and that delays in addressing certain legal questions could result in public complications that would be difficult to manage. Kate felt the world tilting around her as she realized the scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a personal crisis or a family matter that could be handled privately. Whatever door William had opened had led to legal complexities that involved constitutional law, succession rights, and potentially the very legitimacy of their royal status. The implications were staggering, and Kate understood why William had been carrying such a heavy burden alone. The afternoon passed in a blur of worry and speculation. Kate tried to maintain normal routines with the children, helping with homework, and discussing their upcoming school events, but her mind kept returning to the legal documents and the constitutional lawyer's urgent tone. She found herself studying George's face, wondering how a 10-year-old boy might handle learning that his future as a potential king was somehow in question. Charles called again in the late afternoon, his voice carrying a new level of concern. He explained that he had been contacted by government officials who were aware of certain constitutional questions that had recently arisen. The conversation was cryptic, but clearly serious, with references to parliamentary procedures and constitutional precedents that Kate didn't fully understand. Charles assured her that the palace's legal team was working to address the situation, but his tone suggested that the outcomes were far from certain. As evening approached, Kate realized that she was facing a crisis that extended far beyond her marriage or her family's personal happiness. The royal institution itself seemed to be under threat from whatever William had discovered. The silence from the royal household wasn't just about protecting their privacy. It was about preventing a constitutional crisis that could shake the foundations of the monarchy itself. Kate spent the evening in the children's playroom, watching them build elaborate structures with wooden blocks, while her own world seemed to be crumbling around her. George carefully placed each piece, explaining to his younger siblings how balance and foundation were essential for stability. His innocent words struck Kate as painfully ironic, given that the very foundations of their royal life were apparently being questioned by constitutional lawyers and government officials. When William returned that night, even later than the previous evening, Kate was waiting for him in his study. She had positioned herself behind his desk, surrounded by the legal documents she had found, determined to force a conversation about their future. The look of resignation on William's face when he saw her there told her that the time for secrets and half-truths had finally come to an end. William stood in the doorway of his study, his shoulders sagging with defeat as he saw Kate surrounded by the legal documents. The carefully constructed wall of secrecy he had built over the past weeks crumbled in an instant, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked vulnerable and afraid. Kate watched as her husband, usually so composed and confident in his royal role, struggled to find words that could explain the inexplicable. Slowly, William moved to the chair, across from his desk, sitting down heavily as if the weight of his secrets had become too much to bear standing. He looked at Kate with eyes that held a mixture of love, regret, and something that frightened her more than anything else: genuine fear for their future. The silence stretched between them, until William finally began to speak, his voice hoarse, with exhaustion and emotion. The story that emerged was more devastating than Kate could have imagined. 3 weeks earlier, William had been contacted by a historian named Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who specialized in royal genealogy and succession law. She had been researching archival materials for a book about 20th century royal marriages, when she discovered documents that called into question the legitimacy of certain royal unions, including the marriage that had produced William's grandfather's line. Kate felt her blood run cold as William explained the implications. According to Dr. Hartwell's research, there were irregularities in the documentation of a crucial marriage ceremony from the 1920s that had never been properly investigated or resolved. The ceremony in question involved William's great-great-grandfather, and if the marriage was indeed invalid according to the laws of that time, it would create a chain reaction that could affect the legitimacy of every subsequent heir, including William himself. The legal terminology that Kate had struggled to understand earlier suddenly made horrifying sense. Constitutional lawyers were examining whether centuries-old marriage laws and succession rights could be challenged in modern courts. If the historical marriage was deemed invalid, it could theoretically remove William from the line of succession entirely, making his children illegitimate heirs to the throne. William's hands shook as he retrieved a folder from the locked drawer, finally opening it to reveal the documents that had been consuming his thoughts for weeks. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, church records, and legal analyses spread across the desk, like pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted to solve. Kate stared at the papers, realizing that these seemingly innocent historical documents had the power to destroy everything they had built their lives around. Dr. Hartwell had been discreet about her discovery initially, reaching out to William through official royal channels and requesting a private meeting to discuss her findings. She wasn't seeking publicity or trying to create a scandal. She was genuinely concerned about the constitutional implications of her research and wanted to ensure that the royal family was aware of the potential legal challenges before they became public knowledge. The meetings William had been attending were with constitutional lawyers, government officials, and historical experts who were trying to determine whether Dr. Hartwell's concerns had merit. Each consultation had brought more disturbing news about the complexity of succession law and the potential for legal challenges that could take years to resolve. The lawyers were unanimous in their opinion that the matter needed to be addressed, quickly and carefully to prevent it from becoming a public crisis. Kate felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. She asked William why he hadn't shared this burden with her from the beginning, and his answer revealed the depth of his love and his fear. He had hoped that the lawyers would quickly dismiss Dr. Hartwell's concerns, allowing their family to continue their royal duties without ever having to confront such a devastating possibility. He couldn't bear the thought of putting Kate and the children through the stress of uncertainty, if there was any chance the situation could be resolved quietly. The conversation continued late into the night, as William shared details about the legal opinions he had received. Some experts argued that modern succession laws would override any historical irregularities, while others suggested that the very foundation of royal legitimacy rested on unbroken legal traditions that couldn't be ignored. The uncertainty was maddening, and Kate began to understand why William had seemed like a different person in recent weeks. Charles had been briefed on the situation just 2 days earlier, which explained his unexpected visit and his obvious concern. The king was facing a constitutional crisis that could potentially affect not just William's position, but the stability of the monarchy itself. Government officials were quietly preparing for various scenarios, including the possibility that the matter could become public knowledge and require immediate response from Parliament and the courts. Kate asked about the children and how this situation might affect their futures. William's voice broke as he explained that George, Charlotte, and Louis were potentially facing a world where their royal status could be questioned or removed entirely. The thought of his children dealing with such uncertainty and public scrutiny was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire situation for William to contemplate. The international implications were also staggering. As future head of the Commonwealth and heir to multiple royal titles, William's legitimacy was tied to constitutional arrangements in numerous countries. If his position was legally challenged, It could create diplomatic complications and constitutional crises across the Commonwealth nations that recognize the British monarch as their head of state. Kate realized that the palace's silence and the increased security measures were part of a carefully orchestrated effort to contain the situation until legal questions could be resolved. Every aspect of their public life was being managed to prevent any indication that something was wrong, while behind the scenes, lawyers and government officials worked frantically to find solutions to an unprecedented constitutional problem. Dawn broke over Kensington Palace. William and Kate sat together in his study, surrounded by the legal documents that threatened to tear apart their world. Kate felt emotionally drained, but also relieved that the secrets were finally in the open between them. Whatever they faced, they would face it together, as they had promised each other on their wedding day more than a decade earlier. The weight of uncertainty still pressed down on them, but sharing the burden had somehow made it more bearable. Kate understood now why William had looked so haunted in recent weeks, and she felt guilty for the moments when she had wondered if he was keeping secrets about their marriage. The truth was far worse and far more complex than any personal betrayal could have been. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of William's secure phone ringing. It was barely 6 in the morning, but constitutional crises didn't respect normal business hours. As William answered the call, Kate could see from his expression that whatever news he was receiving would bring no relief from the nightmare that had engulfed their family. The phone call brought news that made William's face go pale. Kate watched her husband's expression change from cautious hope to devastation as he listened to the voice on the other end. When he hung up, the silence in the study felt suffocating. Dr. Hartwell had gone to the press after becoming frustrated with what she perceived as the royal family's attempts to suppress her research. A major newspaper would be publishing her findings in less than 48 hours. Kate felt her world crumble as William explained the implications. Once the story became public, there would be no containing the constitutional crisis. Opposition politicians would demand immediate investigations. Legal challenges would be filed in courts across the Commonwealth, and their family would be thrust into the center of a media storm that could last for years. The children's faces flashed through Kate's mind, and she imagined them trying to understand why their father's right to be king was being questioned on television news programs. William's phone rang again immediately. This time it was Charles calling an emergency family meeting at Buckingham Palace within the hour. The tone of his voice, even through the speaker, carried a gravity that Kate had never heard before. She realized that the next few hours would determine not just their personal future, but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. The drive to Buckingham Palace passed in tense silence. Kate stared out the window at the London streets, wondering if this might be one of the last times she traveled through the city as the Princess of Wales. The thought seemed surreal, but the legal documents spread across William's desk had made it clear that their royal titles and positions were now in serious jeopardy. Everything they had built their adult lives around was suddenly uncertain. At the palace, they were ushered into the king's private study, where Charles was meeting with the Lord Chancellor, the Prime Minister, and several constitutional experts. The atmosphere was grave, and Kate could see the strain on everyone's faces as they grappled with a situation that had no clear precedent in modern constitutional law. The Queen Consort sat quietly in the corner, her usual warmth replaced by obvious worry about the family's future. The Lord Chancellor presented the legal analysis in stark terms. Dr. Hartwell's research had uncovered genuine irregularities in the 1920s marriage ceremony that could not be easily dismissed. While some legal experts argued that subsequent acts of Parliament had validated the entire line of succession, others maintained that fundamental questions about royal legitimacy could not be resolved through legislative action alone. The courts would ultimately need to decide, a process that could take years and create unprecedented constitutional uncertainty. The Prime Minister explained the political implications with equal frankness. Opposition parties were already preparing to exploit the situation, calling for immediate investigations into royal legitimacy and demanding transparency about succession laws. Some Republican groups were describing the crisis as an opportunity to finally abolish the monarchy entirely, arguing that questions about royal legitimacy demonstrated the fundamental weakness of hereditary institutions. Kate listened to these discussions with growing horror, realizing that their personal crisis was becoming a national political issue. She thought about George, Charlotte, and Louis at school, blissfully unaware that their entire future was being debated in the highest levels of government. The thought of her children learning about this situation from news reports or playground gossip rather than from their parents made her feel physically ill. Charles addressed William directly, his voice heavy with the weight of fatherly concern and royal duty. He explained that the monarchy's survival might depend on how they handled the next few days. If they appeared defensive or secretive, public opinion could turn against them permanently. But if they were too transparent about the legal uncertainties, they might inadvertently validate challenges to their legitimacy that could prove impossible to overcome. The constitutional experts presented several scenarios, none of them appealing. They could challenge Dr. Hartwell's research publicly, risking a prolonged legal battle that would keep the controversy in the headlines for years. They could acknowledge the historical irregularities while arguing that modern succession laws made them irrelevant, potentially opening the door to broader questions about royal authority. Or they could attempt to reach some kind of private settlement with Dr. Hartwell, though her decision to go to the press suggested that option was no longer available. Kate found herself speaking for the first time in the meeting, her voice steady, despite the turmoil in her heart. She asked about the children's welfare and how they could protect George, Charlotte, and Louis from the emotional trauma of having their royal identity questioned so publicly. The room fell silent as everyone grappled with the human cost of a constitutional crisis that had become bigger than any individual family member. The Queen Consort finally spoke, sharing her own experience of marrying into the royal family during times of crisis and uncertainty. She reminded everyone that the monarchy had survived far worse challenges than questions about historical marriage ceremonies. Public scandals, world wars, and social upheaval had all tested the institution's resilience, and each time the royal family had emerged stronger by facing difficulties with dignity and transparency. As the meeting continued, Kate realized that she was witnessing the potential end of everything she had known since marrying William. The woman who had spent years learning royal protocols and representing the crown with grace was now facing the possibility that her husband might lose his birthright and their children might grow up as private citizens rather than future monarchs. The lawyers presented one final option that made Kate's blood run cold. William could voluntarily renounce his claim to the throne, removing himself and his children from the line of succession before the legal challenges could proceed through the courts. This would prevent a prolonged constitutional crisis and protect the monarchy's stability. But it would also mean abandoning the life and duty that had defined William since birth. The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence. Kate watched William's face as he processed the implications of voluntarily giving up everything he had been raised to inherit, the crown that had been his destiny since childhood, the duties that had shaped his identity, the legacy he had hoped to pass to his children. All of it could disappear with a single legal document. Charles looked older than Kate had ever seen, him as he contemplated the possibility of his eldest son stepping aside to save the monarchy. The irony was devastating. The heir who had spent decades preparing to serve his country might need to sacrifice his birthright to protect the institution he loved. The meeting ended without resolution, but with a clear timeline. They had less than 36 hours before Dr. Hartwell's story would be published, and whatever decision they made would need to be final and irreversible. Kate left Buckingham Palace knowing that the next day and a half would determine whether her husband would remain the heir to the throne or become the prince who sacrificed everything to save the crown for future generations. The drive back to Kensington Palace was even quieter than the journey there had been. Kate and William both understood that they were facing the most important decision of their lives, one that would affect not just their own future, but the future of their children and the British monarchy itself. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, and Kate found herself wondering how anyone could make such an impossible choice. The evening air felt heavy as Kate and William returned to Kensington Palace, both lost in their own thoughts about the impossible decision ahead of them. The palace, normally a place of comfort and security, now felt like a prison where they were trapped with a choice that would define their family's future forever. Kate looked at the familiar portraits lining the hallways, wondering if future visitors would see them as the last generation of their line or as the family who saved the monarchy through sacrifice. The children were already asleep when they arrived home, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the turmoil that surrounded them. Kate stood in each of their bedrooms watching George, Charlotte, and Louis sleep peacefully, unaware that their entire world might change forever within the next 24 hours. The sight of their innocent slumber nearly broke her resolve, and she found herself crying silently as she imagined having to explain to them why Daddy might no longer be the future king. William spent the night pacing through the palace corridors, wrestling with a decision that felt impossible to make. Kate found him before dawn in the portrait gallery, staring at paintings of his ancestors who had ruled Britain for centuries. The weight of tradition and history seemed to press down on him as he contemplated becoming the first in his line to voluntarily step away from the throne since his great-great-uncle Edward VIII, though the circumstances could not have been more different. As morning light filtered through the windows, Kate made a decision that surprised even herself. She called Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell directly, using the contact information she had found among William's papers. The conversation that followed would later be described by both women as one of the most important exchanges of their lives, though it began with mutual suspicion and defensiveness. Dr. Hartwell was initially wary of speaking with Kate, assuming that the call was an attempt to pressure her into withdrawing her story or suppressing her research. But as Kate explained the human cost of the constitutional crisis and the impact on 3 innocent children, the historian's tone began to soften. Dr. Hartwell revealed that she had never intended for her research to destroy a family or create such devastating consequences for William and his children. The 2 women talked for nearly 2 hours, with Kate learning more about Dr. Hartwell's background and motivations. The historian was a respected academic who had stumbled upon the irregularities while conducting legitimate historical research. She had initially hoped that bringing the matter to royal attention would result in quiet resolution and historical accuracy, not a constitutional crisis that threatened to tear apart the monarchy. Dr. Hartwell explained that she had gone to the press only after feeling that the royal family and government officials were trying to suppress historically important information. She believed that transparency about royal history, even uncomfortable truths, was essential for maintaining public trust in the monarchy. However, she was genuinely distressed to learn about the personal impact her revelations were having on William's family. Kate found herself in the unexpected position of defending the monarchy to someone who had inadvertently threatened its foundation. She explained how William had dedicated his entire life to public service and preparing for his future role as king. She described the charitable work, the diplomatic missions, and the countless ways that William had tried to modernize and improve the royal institution for future generations. The conversation took an emotional turn when Kate spoke about her children and their confusion over their father's recent behavior. She described George's innocent questions about royal duty and Charlotte's artistic drawings of family castles and crowns. Dr. Hartwell listened with growing discomfort as she realized that her academic research had real-world consequences for a family she had never met but whose lives she had inadvertently turned upside down. By midday, an unexpected development had emerged from Kate's phone call. Dr. Hartwell agreed to delay publication of her story for 72 hours while she consulted with additional legal experts about the constitutional implications of her research. She had been disturbed by Kate's description of the potential human cost and wanted to ensure that her historical findings were presented in a way that was both academically honest and sensitive to the current royal family's situation. The reprieve gave William and his legal team additional time to explore options that had not been fully considered in the rushed crisis meetings. Constitutional lawyers began examining precedents for addressing historical irregularities without invalidating entire lines of succession. They discovered that similar situations had arisen in other European monarchies and had been resolved through various legal mechanisms that preserved institutional stability while acknowledging historical complexities. Charles called an emergency meeting that afternoon, this time with a more optimistic tone than the previous day's gathering. The additional time had allowed government officials to explore diplomatic solutions that could satisfy both Dr. Hartwell's academic concerns and the royal family's need for stability. Several options emerged that could address the historical irregularities through legislative or legal processes that would not require William to renounce his claim to the throne. The most promising solution involved a formal parliamentary review of succession laws that would explicitly address historical questions while reaffirming the legitimacy of the current royal line. This approach would satisfy Dr. Hartwell's desire for historical transparency while providing legal clarity that would prevent future challenges to royal legitimacy. The process would be public but controlled, allowing for open discussion of the issues without creating the chaos of unresolved constitutional questions. Kate felt a cautious optimism as these new possibilities were discussed. The solution wasn't perfect, and it would still result in public scrutiny of their family's legitimacy, but it offered a path forward that didn't require William to sacrifice his birthright or their children to lose their royal futures. The parliamentary review would be uncomfortable and politically challenging, but it would provide definitive answers that could put the constitutional questions to rest permanently. William expressed relief at having options beyond the stark choice between renouncing the throne or facing years of legal uncertainty. He had spent sleepless nights imagining how to explain to George that he might never be king, and the possibility of avoiding that conversation brought visible relief to his strained features. The weight that had been crushing him for weeks began to lift slightly as viable alternatives to personal sacrifice emerged. Dr. Hartwell was contacted about the proposed parliamentary solution and expressed willingness to cooperate with a formal review process rather than pursuing immediate publication of her research. She understood that her academic findings could be presented more effectively as part of an official government investigation rather than through sensationalized newspaper coverage that might oversimplify complex constitutional questions. As evening approached, Kate felt emotionally drained but cautiously hopeful for the first time in weeks. The crisis was far from over, but the immediate threat of William's forced abdication had receded. Their family would still face months or possibly years of public scrutiny as the parliamentary review proceeded, but they would face it together, and with their royal status intact. The children remained blissfully unaware of how close they had come to losing their royal future, though Kate knew that age-appropriate conversations about the situation would soon become necessary. George, Charlotte, and Louis deserved to understand what was happening to their family, even if the full constitutional implications were beyond their comprehension. William and Kate spent their first peaceful evening together in weeks, sitting in their private quarters and processing the emotional roller coaster they had experienced. The locked drawer in William's study stood open, its secrets finally revealed and no longer carrying the power to destroy their world. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a united family rather than allowing secrets and fear to divide them from within. 3 months after the constitutional crisis had nearly torn their world apart, Kate stood in the same palace window where this nightmare had begun, watching William play football with their children in the garden below. The sight brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness this time, but of profound relief and gratitude. The parliamentary review had concluded just 2 weeks earlier, formally reaffirming William's position in the line of succession while acknowledging the historical complexities that Dr. Hartwell had discovered. The public handling of the constitutional questions had been masterful, orchestrated by government officials who understood the delicate balance between transparency and stability. Rather than presenting the situation as a crisis that threatened the monarchy, they had framed it as an opportunity to strengthen royal legitimacy through modern legal clarity. The review process had been thorough but respectful, examining historical records while emphasizing the importance of institutional continuity. Dr. Hartwell had emerged as an unexpected ally rather than an enemy. Her academic expertise had proven invaluable during the parliamentary hearings, and she had worked closely with royal historians to ensure that her findings were presented accurately and constructively. The relationship between the historian and the royal family had evolved from mutual suspicion to genuine respect, with Dr. Hartwell even being invited to contribute to a new official history of royal succession laws. The children had handled the situation better than Kate had dared to hope. Age-appropriate conversations about family history and royal responsibility had actually brought them closer together as a family. George had shown remarkable maturity in understanding that being royal meant sometimes facing difficult questions about the past, while Charlotte and Louis had simply been relieved that their father wasn't as sad and worried as he had been for those terrible weeks. Public opinion had largely supported the royal family throughout the crisis, with most citizens appreciating the transparency of the parliamentary review process. Rather than damaging the monarchy's reputation, the careful handling of the constitutional questions had actually strengthened public confidence in royal institutions. Polls showed increased support for the monarchy and particular admiration for how William and Kate had handled the personal stress of the situation. The relationship between William and Kate had also emerged stronger from the crisis. The weeks of secrecy and isolation had taught them both the importance of facing challenges together rather than trying to protect each other through silence. They had developed new patterns of communication and mutual support that made their marriage more resilient and honest than it had ever been before. Charles had expressed private pride in how his son and daughter-in-law had navigated the crisis, with dignity and wisdom. The experience had also served as valuable preparation for the kinds of unexpected challenges that William would face as king. The constitutional review had provided clarity about succession laws that would benefit future generations, turning a potential disaster into a long-term strengthening of royal institutions. The locked drawer in William's study now stood permanently open, containing historical documents and legal papers that no longer held any power to threaten their family. Kate had suggested keeping it open as a reminder that secrets, however well-intentioned, could never truly protect the people they loved. Transparency and trust, even in difficult circumstances, had proven to be far more powerful tools for preserving their family and their royal role. Maria Santos, Kate's lady-in-waiting, had become an even more trusted confidant throughout the crisis. Her discreet support and practical wisdom had helped Kate maintain her public duties while dealing with private turmoil. The palace staff as a whole had shown remarkable loyalty and professionalism, protecting the family's privacy while helping to manage the unprecedented constitutional situation. International reactions had been largely positive, with Commonwealth nations expressing satisfaction that the succession questions had been resolved definitively. Diplomatic relationships had actually been strengthened by the transparent approach to addressing constitutional concerns, and several other monarchies had praised the British model for handling sensitive historical questions with appropriate gravity and openness. William's relationship with his father had also deepened through their shared navigation of the crisis. Charles had provided crucial support and guidance while respecting William's need to make his own decisions about how to handle the situation. The experience had prepared both men for the eventual transition of royal responsibility and had demonstrated their ability to work together effectively under pressure. The children's understanding of their royal heritage had been enriched rather than damaged by learning about the complexities of royal history. Their conversations about duty, service, and historical responsibility had become more sophisticated and meaningful. George, in particular, had begun to grasp that being a future king would require facing difficult questions and making thoughtful decisions about challenging situations. Kate's own role as a future queen had been clarified and strengthened through the crisis. Her direct intervention with Dr. Hartwell had been crucial in finding a peaceful resolution, and her ability to balance family protection with institutional responsibility had impressed government officials and royal advisors. She had proven herself capable of independent action and wise judgment in the most challenging circumstances. The memorial service held to honor the royal ancestors, whose marriage irregularities had sparked the crisis, became a celebration of family history rather than a source of shame or embarrassment. The service acknowledged the complexity of historical events while celebrating the continuity of royal service across generations. Dr. Hartwell attended as an honored guest, representing the academic community's contribution to understanding royal history. As Kate watched her family playing in the garden, she reflected on how much stronger they had all become through facing their darkest hour together. The constitutional crisis that had once threatened to destroy everything they held Dear had ultimately reinforced their commitment to each other and to their royal duties. The door that William had opened, despite leading initially to fear and uncertainty, had ultimately brought them greater understanding, stronger relationships, and deeper appreciation for the precious life they shared. The tears in Kate's eyes were tears of gratitude for a family that had survived its greatest test and emerged more united than ever before. Whatever challenges the future might bring, she knew they would face them together, with honesty, courage, and the unshakable foundation of love that had carried them through their most difficult days. The royal silence that had once frightened her had been replaced by open communication and shared strength that would serve them well throughout their lifelong journey of service to the crown and to each other.